case study presentation, we have the 30 Years War. I'm Michaela Kovacic.
I'm Alyssa Wolf.
I'm Nick Patrick.
And I'm Joseph Capita.
We just want to give you an overview of sort of how we outlined our case study and what we're going to present to you. None of us knew what the 30 Years War was when we started, so we want to give you a little bit of background just in general, like who participated, where it happened, things like that. The key factors for the war, what started the war, what played into it. It's actually a lot more famous than any of us realized for a lot of reasons, and so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what ended it, what were the results after it ended, and then what was the religious motivation, since this is religious conflict and peace building.
So what exactly is the 30 Years' War? Well, the war started in 1618 and concluded in 1648, which explains the 30-year war. It was a religious conflict between German Protestants and German Catholics. They had religious disputes, which caused a lot of tension between those two groups and violence. It was the first continental-wide war in Europe, and it was fought mostly throughout the Holy Roman Empire.
This graph right here, it shows pretty much what states were in the war. The pink and the red states, they were against the emperor, and they were mostly Protestants. The pink states, they were indirectly involved with the war, and the red states, they were directly involved. The black and the gray states, they were fighting for the emperor, and they were the Catholic states. And the gray was indirectly involved, and the black was directly involved. You can see the red states and the pink states. They made more of an effort to fight for their land and get it back. And you can just see what states were involved throughout the years.
So just some key factors that we'll be discussing, just about this ongoing dispute between the Catholics and Protestants that has been going on prior to the start of this war since the Protestant Reformation. The Peace of Augsburg, personal ambitions of King Ferdinand II, who had a very great role in the 30 Years' War, and the revolt of the Protestants of Bohemia.
So this all started with the Protestant Reformation, which was started by Martin Luther. Typically it dates back to 1517, but it actually was going on before that. But Martin Luther famously tacked up his 95 Theses to the Catholic Church, stating his issues with the Catholic Church and the way that they were practicing. It was never intended to start a new church. It was only intended to reform the current Catholic Church. The conflict divided the Catholic Church, little c, meaning universal church, into two different churches, the Protestants, the Protesters, and the Roman Catholics. The new Protestant church rapidly gained followers as people did not want a state to dictate what their religious beliefs had to be. So the Protestant Reformation, again, around 1517, revolt breaks out, people are protesting, the church is split, there's a lot of confusion and violence. It ends with the Peace of Augsburg. However, the tensions are reignited in the early 17th century, which would have been the early 1600s. King Ferdinand, as was mentioned before, and a few other, the Holy Roman Emperor, before him, and then a few other state leaders try to squelch Protestantism, and the former truces of the Peace of Augsburg are broken and revolt breaks out. And the 30 Years' War begins in May 1618. And let me add one other thing. I wasn't going to say this, but it's kind of funny. So basically how the war started was a Protestant group of protesters gets together and they threw two Catholic cabinet policy makers out of a 70-story window, and they landed in a pile of manure, and it's called the Defenestration of Prague. And that's what dates the start of the war.
The key players in the key players in the 30 Years' War was obviously the Protestants and the Catholics, but the countries that were involved was France, Sweden, Denmark, Spain, Germany, and the Habsburg dynasty, which at that time was ruled by the Holy Roman Emperor.
Alright, so a major key player was King Ferdinand II, who was alive from 1578 to 1637. He was crowned King of Bohemia in 1617, crowned King of Hungary in 1618, and in 1619 he was known as the Holy Roman Emperor. And as Michaela was talking about the defenestration of Prague, this was the root cause of the start of the war, and this was because King Ferdinand, he actually sent two of his representatives to Prague to kind of like convert everyone back to Catholicism. So since then, you can just tell that his strong devotion to Catholicism had him like forcing and reconverting people back, and how powerful he was that after the 30 Years' War, he actually was able to convert Austria and Bohemia back to Catholicism. So in the Peace of Prague, which King Ferdinand II signed in 1635, just 2 years prior to his death, he signed this between John George I of Saxony, and this brought an end to the war between the Bohemian Protestants and the Bohemian Catholics. However, this obviously didn't bring an end to the whole 30 Years' War, as France in 1637 was on Spain's side against Germany.
Now, since this war covered a vast amount of time, it's kind of simple to grasp it based on its a division between 4 different phases. Those are the Bohemian, the Danish, the Swedish, and the French phase. Now, the Bohemian and the Danish phases where more the religious conflicts take place, and the Swedish and French phase is more of a political dispute. The Bohemian phase started in 1618 and concluded in 1622. Bohemians are made up mostly of Czechs and Slovaks, and they're the Protestant group. Now, when Ferdinand II became emperor, the Bohemians did not like that at all because he was Catholic and he was from the Habsburg power. So they despised him. And Ferdinand, his goal was to, get rid of the Protestants. He didn't want to tolerate anything that they had to do or any of their beliefs. And like Michaela and Alyssa mentioned, the defenestration of Prague occurred during this time. And one thing they didn't mention is there was different views of how those 2 people that fell out or were thrown out the window survived. If you were a Catholic, the Catholics believed that when they were thrown out the window, they were caught by angels and brought down to the ground and ran off. And the Protestant view was with the pile of manure at the bottom, and so they landed in it, and that kind of saved them. During this time, the tension between the Catholics and Protestants, the Catholics actually won of the war at White Mountain, which kind of gave them more power over the Protestants. The second phase was the Danish phase. It started in 1625 and concluded in 1629. Christian IV of Denmark actually made a movement to try to get back some of the Protestant land. He wanted to strengthen the Protestant movement and annex the German lands. Ferdinand noticed that he was making this attempt, so he raised a mercenary army to defeat the Danes in 1626. Ferdinand, at this point, wanted to end all resistance from the Protestants, and he passed the Edict of Restitution in 1629, which restored Protestant states to Catholicism. Now, going into the Swedish phase from 1630 to 1635, Cardinal Richelieu of France wanted to continue Christian IV's effort to push the Protestant movement. He was the ally of the Protestants and gave financial aid to Sweden with their efforts to fight back against the emperor. Now, the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus, he was more of a hands-on ruler, and he was really the main figure of the movement towards the Protestants reclaiming their land. And he actually won the battle against the Catholics, but was killed during that battle, and his death led to the weakening of the Protestant movement. But because of these efforts, the Peace of Prague was established, and that revoked the Edict of Restitution that was established during the Danish phase. The final phase was the French phase, which lasted from 1635 to the conclusion of the war. This was the most gruesome of the 4 phases. It caused a lot of destruction towards Germany, to their land, to civilians were murdered, their agriculture was destroyed, and it really affected German culture. Now, kind of in this phase, the French and the Swedish kind of switched roles. And before, the French were funding the Swedish effort, but now the French armies got involved, and the Swedes really backed them financially to help support their effort. And it got to the point where fighting just became so bloody and gruesome that peace talks began at Westphalia, and this was the official end of the war, where territories were divided and independence was recognized for some states.
This war was noteworthy because it was the largest and most destructive war in that time period. And most of the major powers in Europe was involved with the war, as we stated before. It was considered great because each war overlapped each other. There was no time for reconstruction or any rebuilding to happen during the in between the wars. The population of the country decreased drastically. The total death was between 3 million and 11,500,000 people. And there were multiple mercenary killings, and these soldiers would just go through the towns and kill the citizens. And it redrew the religious and political map of Europe. These are two different maps of Europe before and after the war. The map on the right is the map of Europe before the war in 1618, and it shows how it was drawn before, it shows how it was drawn before the war broke out. And the map to the left is the map of Europe after the war, and that was in 1648. And you can see how it was altered. States gained independence, and the territories were all divided evenly. Continuing on with what makes it noteworthy, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation had divided Germany. It divided it into hostile Protestants and into Catholic camps. Both parties reached out for support from foreign countries. The war was fought mostly on German soil, and that was a huge impact to Germany, because a third of all their towns were destroyed, and a total of 1,500 towns were destroyed completely, and 2,000 of their castles were destroyed as well, along with 18,000 villages. And this obviously impacted their financial situation greatly.
So what ended the war? Obviously, after 30 years was a very exhausting time, and there was just a lot of destruction in Germany and the surrounding countries. And it was the Treaty of Westphalia that ended the war, which not only ended the 30 Years' War, but ended an 80 Years' War that was going on between Spain and the Dutch Republic. And just like the high number of total deaths, which was it was just like outrageous. I mean, almost half the population has been lost. And after King Ferdinand II died in 1637, King Ferdinand III took over, and by 1648 he was kind of forced to give up the effort and just to finally sign a peace treaty with Sweden and France. So the results of the war, as I said before, about like half the population was like completely diminished, and cities were destroyed. And the Peace of Westphalia, it was signed on October 24th, 1648, and this kind of stated that Swiss independence from Austria, the Netherlands independence of Spain, and that overall that there was like no like one-step rule of the church, that the Roman Catholic Church was like no longer an authoritative power. And so since like 1644, I guess like is whenever peace was like starting to finally come between the countries, but it took 4 years to finally end the war. And this kind of shifted the whole balance of power in Europe, of how like the North was like the more Protestants and Lutherans, and the South was strictly Catholics. So, and like it shifted like religious, social, and politically. And this war was kind of like fought to end like all of the future religious wars, and that this was kind of like the start of like that everyone like equality, I guess, between like religions.
So what is the religious role in the conflict? Obviously, it started as a completely religious war between the Protestants and the Catholics. It's actually famously known as Europe's last religious war. However, as Joe stated, after the first two phases, it became less and less about Protestants versus Catholic, and more about political boundaries and political power. And so what happens is in the last two phases, it morphs into a struggle for power and for economic stability. And obviously, what you want to do if you're in power already is keep the power. And so that's where we see King Ferdinand, 2 and 3, continuing to fight for the Catholic right. However, it wasn't really about being Catholic or Protestant, it was about having power. And so the war at the end, in the last phase, is actually known as Europe's first political power struggle or political power war. And so you see how, even though it starts as religious war and religious conflict, it can't actually just be seen as that. It morphs and it changes, and there's more than one factor, because religion doesn't happen in a vacuum. It can't happen in a vacuum in conflict either, and so other factors play into it.
Here's a short little video going over what the war was about as well.
This will give you, because there's so much going on, this will give you a kind of a visual.
During the 16th century, the Reformation had been dividing the Holy Roman Empire, and although Lutherans had been officially recognized in 1555, the many Calvinist rulers and their citizens were not. So the resulting tensions caused Protestants and Catholic states to form alliances. Thus, foreign powers had a vested interest in these developments. The French were encircled by Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs and sought to weaken them. The Spanish hoped to retain their Dutch provinces and maintain military access along the Spanish road, and the Protestant Scandinavian countries looked to expand their influence in northern Germany. But the immediate cause of the war can be found in Bohemia. Holy Roman Emperor Matthias died and had no heirs, so along with the Bohemian Diet, elected the Catholic Ferdinand to take the throne of Hungary and Bohemia. Fearing they would lose their religious rights and preferring Frederick V the Palatinate, Bohemian Protestants threw the representatives of Ferdinand out of the palace windows, which started the Bohemian Revolt in 1618. The rebellion was initially quite successful and soon spread to Transylvania, but besides from limited support from the Ottoman Empire, who declared war on the Habsburg allied Poland, the rebels' only real ally was Frederick the Palatinate. So, as the rebels had little international support, Ferdinand, now the Holy Roman Emperor, was able to reclaim Bohemia after crushing the rebels at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. The Palatinate was now left by itself, so Spanish troops invading from the lowlands easily overwhelmed them in 1622, forcing Frederick to flee while his lands were confiscated. Side note, all the turmoil as well as family crop failures during the war saw a resurgence of witch hunts. But back to the war. Christian IV of Denmark was worried that his role as the champion of Protestantism was challenged when Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden declared war on the Polish. So in 1625 he reignited the war to turn back to the Catholic gains. However, the Habsburg forces under the generals Tilly and Wallenstein quickly rallied the Danes and drove them back into Jutland. Plus, domestic problems in France and England prevented them from sending help to the Danes. So the Danes had to admit defeat in 1629, but the Protestants got a new champion a year later, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. In fact, he had been involved in the war for a couple of years after he sent troops to help besiege Protestants in Stralsund, a town in northern Germany. The Swedes started the campaign successfully as they were many originally encountered. However, during the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, King Adolphus was killed in the battle. The Holy Roman Empire would also suffer the loss of their two great commanders, Tilly and Wallenstein, during this phase of the fighting. Nevertheless, the war continued for another 3 years, and as was common throughout the war, the German states were devastated. It's estimated that by the end of the war, over a third of the German population was killed, thanks in part to the brutality of the mercenary armies. Therefore, war exhaustion was high within the Holy Roman Empire. So, in 1635, Protestant and Catholic men in the states agreed to make peace and end the internal fighting. But the French feared the authority given to the Habsburgs over the Empire member states. Notably, member states could now no longer make foreign alliances, and an imperial army was to be created. So Catholic France formed an alliance with Protestant Sweden and joined in this now political war. The Swedes occupied while the French also helped to start separatist rebellions in Spanish Catalonia in 1640, elsewhere the Habsburg managed to gain the support of their rival Denmark, who looked to contain their neighbours Sweden. And the French and the Swedes continued to be backed by Protestant states like the Dutch provinces and Brandenburg Prussia, but this was largely inconsequential. Both sides tried to make peace for a few years, and it wasn't until the death of Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister of France, in 1648 that it was able to be achieved. However, both Sweden and Denmark, like France and Spain, would continue fighting for a few more years. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the last great religious war in Europe, and is one of the most important treaties in history. It established the idea of territorial integrity, and along with the move from first military conventional armies, this helped form the modern-day nation-states. It also greatly upset the balance of power within Europe. Nations like Sweden and Brandenburg Prussia, split primarily between them, became emergent great powers. Plus, Northern France expanded its borders east and became the dominant landforce in Europe. The Swiss had their independence guaranteed, and the Spanish would have to recognize Dutch independence. On the other hand, the declining Spanish were going to lose more land to the French and face rebellions in Portugal. Plus, the Holy Roman Empire finally had to recognize Calvinism and grant the states more freedom. This ultimately weakened the empire and would later encourage the Ottomans to attack Vienna.
So you can see from this video just how impactful the 30 Years' War was on the way that the states were designed and laid out, and it actually really did change the way that the map of Europe looks. You can also see just how many different components played into the war. It was kind of difficult for us as a group to cover them all and to hit on them all, because it's so packed in there. There's so many things happen economically, politically, religiously, and it all factored into the 30 Years' War.
So that's it for our presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, you said there was no basically time elapse between the dynasties. What happened between 1622 and 1625 between the Bohemians and the Dutch?
A smaller revolt still, and while it officially ended, again, being that time period, there's not a ton of communication between what's happening in a city and then what's happening out sort of like in the actual field, and so revolts and conflict continue.
And it kind of made that move from the religious, battle more into like the political, land battle. Kind of like that change.
Other questions or comments or thoughts?
You guys set the bar high?
How do you think the Peace of Westphalia sets the tone? And you kind of got at this, but like kind of more generally. How do you think the Peace of Westphalia and what that said and did sort of affects or impacts religious dialogue going forward in the next 4 centuries from?
Well, I guess it just kind of changed history. I mean, now you look at us and we're friends with people of all these different religious backgrounds. I think since that peace treaty just kind of shaped the world and everything.
And that peace treaty, it was made after, they kind of came to a sense of why are we doing this? And they finally got to the point when it was just so exhausting and so bloody and so gruesome that they came up with that treaty to kind of find peace and move on from it.
I think that's what I find most fascinating about the 30 Years' War. 30 years of this really, you talk about the last phase, is so gruesome, so much violence. And it's just fascinating to me that after all this time, these peoples, it's almost like they sort of wake up and go, oh, this is a really crappy way to exist. It really stinks to have to kill your neighbors and have your neighbors try to kill you, and this is just not fun. So let's decide that it's okay for you to worship the way you want and me to worship the way I want. I mean, I think that's just so fascinating. That's the thing that I think Westphalia, and then just kind of setting the tone going forward to say, it's okay. There's still going to be religious conflict, but for the most part, our world has sort of said, it's okay for Hindus to exist and do what they do. And we might try to, Christians might try to convert them, or the people who have missionary endeavor, notion of sort of forced conversion is not popular anymore. And Westphalia was kind of this really pivotal moment in the history of religious thinking and sentiment and sort of mentality that said, okay, and it's just such a fun, it's like a light bulb, you know, okay, it's all right for you to just do what you do, as long as it's not messing with my right to do what I want to do. And this is prior to human rights and the notion of religious freedom and those kinds of things. So it's just really.
I find it ironic too, because like Catholics and Protestants still worshipped while the war was going on, because they were fighting this whole war because they didn't want the other people to be able to, you know, to worship in their territory, but it was still happening. So it was 30 years of fighting and bloodshed that really didn't need to happen. And I think that's kind of that it took, for me, it was realization for the people that it took 30 years to figure it out.
And this is where I think the analysis of the political power structures and the geographical question becomes important, because it's not just Catholics and Protestants being pissed off at each other. It's if I cede power to you, my church no longer has power and political power, or my prince, you know, of here in this area of Germany no longer has power over this particular area of land. And of course, in an agrarian culture, land is everything. We don't get that, because land is, we don't have a sense of tie to the land, but land was wealth and power in that time period. And so if you lost land, you lost wealth and power. You lost livelihoods, you lost the ability to survive sometimes. So
I kind of think, you know, that shift from religious focus to more political, I think that was kind of an eye opener too, because once people start seeing, well, like, it's hard to survive. Agriculture was being destroyed, their towns were being destroyed, and I think that really like pushed them to kind of find a settlement of this war, because they were realizing, well, this is getting bigger than just a religious conflict. It's starting to take a toll on our way of living as well.
It's kind of interesting, because Sweden and France at the time were not really good friends with each other because of the religious differences, and what they kind of united over against the Habsburg Empire would be, part of it could be a precursor to the German state. It was a descendant of the First Reich, which was the Holy Roman Empire, and it's kind of funny how Europe always comes together to beat up Germany.
Well, stuff kept happening in Germany. It seems to be the locus of so many, you know, a lot of violence, and in the 20th century, a lot of problems.
It's kind of a weird question, but like, where was Great Britain during all of this? Because I know they were having their own sort of religious conflict within their own country at the same time. So they just personally choose to stay out of this, or were they just so far out of the loop that they didn't matter?
You guys touched on this a little bit. They were having their own domestic difficulties. They were conveniently located too. They didn't really have to be involved, because they didn't share technical borders with any of these places. So I think that's what geopolitical analysis becomes really.
And again, really the key players are the people that they're fighting over the land. Really, like, yeah, it's a religious conflict, but it's about power. And Great Britain wasn't part of that power play. So I think that's why they're sort of excluded.
Great Britain would have had interest in ensuring that certain leaders and certain countries stayed in power in terms of alliances, but this is the 1600s, so that would have been a time of Bloody Mary and Queen Elizabeth the First, right? Yeah. So they're having all kinds of internal problems with power plays and the Catholic Protestant thing, and I forget when Mary became queen. That might have been the late 1500s. I forget how long King Henry VIII lived, but you know, she came in and killed a bunch of people, and then her sister came to power, and so they had all these problems going on. So I think those two mostly explain.
Like,
it's a good question.
It's not important. Never mind. Forget it.
Any other questions? Comments?
Thank you.